invitation to talk to you today about the book that I just co-authored, Mexican American Baseball in the South Bay. My name is Ron Gonzales. I was part of a team of about 8 or 9 writers, local historians who worked on this book, and it came out in just in the spring of 2022. So basically this book looks at the history of Mexican American baseball in San Pedro, Wilmington, and other communities in the South Bay over the past century, especially within the context of the Mexican American communities in which it was played. So this book is the 18th in a series produced by the Latino Baseball History Project, which is a nonprofit project based at Cal State San Bernardino. The idea for doing these books grew out of an interest by the baseball reliquary in documenting the experience of Mexican Americans in the sport of baseball and softball. There was, the founder of the baseball reliquary was a guy named Terry Cannon, and he came up with the idea of creating an exhibit at Cal State Los Angeles in the early 2000s. So that really launched this project and an extensive effort to document the history of baseball and softball in Mexican American communities in Los Angeles, Orange County, the Inland Empire, throughout California, and in a number of communities throughout the U.S. As I mentioned, this is the 18th book. It's probably the most comprehensive in the series. And fortunately, we just had the contribution of a lot of great local historians who had a rich, in-depth knowledge of local communities throughout the South Bay. I came to this project through my time in journalism. About 10 or 12 years ago, I heard about the first book, which was Mexican American Baseball in Los Angeles. So I got a copy of it, and I was doing journalism in Orange County, and I noticed that there were some Orange County guys, men and women, who were identified in the book. So I thought, well, this would be a great local story in Orange County. So I started tracking down old players and did the first of a number of stories about this effort to document early Mexican American players, both men and women. Sort of spot, I'd always been interested in local Mexican American history at the newspapers that I worked at. I'd been in journalism for close to 40 years, often had a hand in covering, overseeing coverage of Mexican American communities, and I always had developed a great interest in the history of these communities, like how old were they, how did they get to be there, who settled them, things like that. And the Mexican American Baseball Project, the Latino Baseball History Project, fit right into that effort. So I started looking around for photos within my own family, and that just sort of spawned an interest in this whole topic, and began contributing to the project probably 10 or 12 years ago, and then contributed to the last couple of books, including Mexican American Baseball in the Santa Maria Valley, and this South Bay book that just came out earlier this year.
So tell me, Ron, just really quick, tell us, you're from the South Bay area as well. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in San Pedro.
In San Pedro.
Right.
Did you play baseball? Is this something that has always been with you as a little kid, and you played baseball, junior high, high school, and possibly even college?
Now, I wasn't, I played a little bit as a kid. I played a lot more as an adult. I was never very good at it, but I had a lot of friends who were really good at it. And I always admired their skills and abilities And that also prompted an interest in just kind of like the art of the sport, the science of the sport, like what makes people good at it. And so that interest sort of played into the project as well.
Now, is this something, as far as baseball, growing up in the San Pedro communities, you talked a little bit, I've seen a little bit of through the correspondence on email, but as far as that, during that time, now let's go back in time, I believe this is taking more in place of the 30s and 40s, as far as baseball players. Now, how was that impacted in those communities, in the Latino communities, and also the Asian communities? The only reason why I ask, because a lot more people probably know about A League of Their Own. A League of Their Own, the movies, that's circa 1943. We don't know too much about the Latinos and the Asians playing in baseball. So during that time, I guess that's post-depression, or just right after that, right after or right before, the Second World War. So during that time, San Pedro, in the neighborhood communities, baseball was like a huge hit for the Latino community and the Asian communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the project really started out looking at early Mexican-American baseball and softball up until around 1960. So a lot of the effort was focused on documenting that period between about 1900 and 1960. So local history is always impacted by what's going on in the world around it. So from 1910 to 1920, there was a revolution in Mexico that resulted in hundreds of thousands of Mexicans fleeing that civil war and coming to the United States. And of course, California had been part of Mexico before it became part of the United States. And there were still families in the Southwest and in California who can trace their roots back to that period. But when this influx of immigrants came, especially during the 19-teens and 1920s, they brought with them baseball. So baseball was something that had been played in Mexico almost as long as it's been played in the United States. From what I've read, it really started picking up popularity in the 1880s in Mexico. And also you can look at the experience of these Mexican immigrants who were settling in San Pedro, Wilmington, that area, the rest of the Southbay. Oftentimes they're coming from other parts of the United States where they may have picked up baseball as well. They may have been miners in Arizona. They may have been railroad workers across the Southwest. So they're bringing with them into this environment in San Pedro their ability to play baseball and their passion for it. So what you see sometime around 1930 is just this explosion of teams in Mexican neighborhoods across San Pedro, Wilmington, and virtually every other community in the South Bay area, from Long Beach to Gardena, Harbor City, Wilmington, Inglewood, Dominguez, just everywhere you can imagine there were fields and teams. And there was also an interest in the media at that point. Salao Opinion, a Spanish language newspaper, had just opened its doors in the mid-1920s, and they began covering these games. So typically in those days, managers and coaches might slip their game scores or game summaries under the doors, and the sports editors would write about these local games. And the San Pedro News-Pilot did the same thing for these Mexican teams, and I'm sure that had a part in egging on the competition. I look at the print media, which I worked in for a long time. I look at the print media in those days as almost like the social media that we have today, where if a kid has a good game, it ends up on Facebook, right? Well, if a team or a player had a good game, it would end up in the News-Pilot or it would end up in La Opinion. So there was a ready audience for these, for stories about sports, and I think it contributed to building up an interest in these teams. There were also a number of women's teams too that were spawned at this time. So when you look at Pedro in particular, you see fields dotting the landscape. And in Mexican communities in particular, there was a field in the Mexican Hollywood area right down on the waterfront. And if you're unfamiliar with Mexican Hollywood, it's a community that existed from about the 20s to the 50s. But it had a field right at O'Farrell in a street that existed in them called Ancon, which is right around where the cruise ship terminal is located today. A field came in at Barton Hill. There was a field in the La Rambla neighborhood where I grew up. Locals like my grandfather created and dragged out a field right there at First and Patton, if you can imagine that was used by a wide variety of teams from throughout San Pedro, including military teams. There were fields that no longer exist. For example, there's a container terminal at the base of Pacific Avenue that was developed for about 10 years as a field called Hollis Field. And Mexican teams played there as well. And there were just a number of other fields throughout town along Gaffey and probably right below where the old YMCA is located. So in a lot of ways, the environment then reflected what you see now is just a lot of facilities where teams could play. For these local communities at that time, it offered a way for these Mexican immigrant men and boys and women to sort of like prove their stuff out on the athletic field. I always look back at it and I think of what a macho environment this must have been. They're competing against Filipino teams. They're competing against Japanese teams. They're competing against each other. They're competing against Chinese teams. They're competing against African American teams. So in addition to creating leagues of their own, like the Mexican Bay League, for example, they were creating inner-city leagues where they would take on these other teams from other communities. And so I imagine these guys being exposed to a large part of the world around them, the world that was shaping up to be the United States that we know today. And they didn't just play locally. You'll find them traveling as far north as Ventura County, sometimes into Santa Barbara. Very common for them to play in Los Angeles and East LA. Frequent trips to Orange County, and also some trips to San Diego. So they were traveling far and wide in a very competitive environment. So I mentioned these other teams, the Croatians too were part of that. The Italians had teams. But in addition to that, there was also this military environment in which they played. So in San Pedro in particular, that means teams representing the Coast Guard, Fort MacArthur, the Marine Corps, and the Pacific Battle Fleet, which was based at San Pedro at that time. So you'd find these Mexican players taking on teams from battleships, aircraft carriers, and all kinds of support ships that would oftentimes, when you read about them, you recognize them as names that are very familiar from their service in World War II, and may even have been at Pearl Harbor and fought there or were damaged there.
So tell me, Marcin, sorry to interject. Talk a little bit about some of the teams that were produced out here in the San Pedro area and the local cities and neighborhoods.
So I would describe the environment as very fluid. So teams would come and go very quickly. They might last a season, they might last several. They might move from locale to locale around the harbor. I look at, so the first photo I found was of a team that my grandfather managed, and he was apparently associated with 3 teams right around the late 20s and early 30s. It would be like the San Pedro Stars, the Palos Verdes Cubs, and the Atlas team, which was later acquired by the Mexican Recreation Club. So it became sort of evolved into sort of a semi-pro team, and by that point he had already left that particular team. So this is basically one group of guys playing under different names, taking on different players at different times, and evolving. In the Mexican Hollywood area, there was a team called the Hollywood Mexicans, and there was even a Hollywood Mexican girls team, and they gradually evolved into the San Pedro Internationals and took on other names after that. There was a very famous team called the Toltecs, the Terminal Island Toltecs, and they eventually rebranded as San Pedro Toltecs, but they flourished for years throughout the early 1930s. So what you see is kind of like a continuum of the same players playing for a team, but maybe a different series of managers working with them. There was a period around 1933 where there was virtually no other teams playing in San Pedro but Mexican teams. The other teams had picked fields outside of the community to play in, and even the sports writer, a guy named Bynner Martin, noticed it at the time when he said something like, it looks to me like right now we've only got Mexican teams, and he listed them all. Hirschman Drugs was another one. Hirschman Drugs had a drugstore right there in the Barton Hill area. And he was encouraging other teams to step forward, return home, or maybe play at the Navy Field, the Trona Field there along the waterfront. So a very interesting, competitive time. Not unlike what you would see now where men and women playing for different teams at different times, and teams changing names fairly regularly as they came under different sponsorships or just decided to change their names.
So Ron, very interesting to learn that there were women teams up there. And we have talked a little bit about, I had mentioned A League of Their Own, the women's baseball team. Going back in the 40s at that time, there's obviously civil rights, women's suffrage, was going through that. And to me, it's great to hear that at that time there were women teams out there. How was that accepted, outside the Latino communities, and what was the atmosphere of that? What was the litmus, test as far as like what did the neighborhoods outside of our Latino and Asian communities, how do they feel about the women having their own teams?
Well, just start with the Latino communities first in answering that question. So before, I had often looked at World War II as a turning point in the experience of Mexican American women, where the workplace really began to open up and more opportunities were opening up for Mexican American women. But those opportunities had really opened up for that. So when Mexican women came to the United States in the teens and 20s, they found ready work in the canneries on Terminal Island. So they really became an important part of the economy of their families and the economy of the community. The Mexican American girls who started playing softball and baseball really are a preview of what's to come later in terms of like the establishment of women in their own right as, as being able to accomplish things in whatever area you can imagine, even in the world of sports. So you find references to teams like the Terminal Island Mermaids, the Piratas, or the Pirates of San Pedro, the Arcoiris, that's a word for rainbow. Barton Hill fielded a women's team. This is all taking place in the late 20s, early 30s, and you really start to see Mexican-American women, girls, coming into their own in this country in a way that I imagine wasn't possible for them in their own, in the countries that in the country that their family came from, a much more traditional society. And the same, so getting back to the larger community that you were asking about, the same thing is happening there as well. So Anglo-American girls are forming teams. You see teams with Croatian girls, Italian girls. They're springing up throughout Pedro, and I imagine that the same is taking place throughout other communities in the Southbay, and really becoming part of this competitive sports environment. And the really remarkable thing is this is 40 years before Title IX. So Title IX comes into being in early in 1972, and it wasn't until maybe about 20 years after that, in the 1990s, where you saw this explosion of women's, very, very competitive women's softball in San Pedro with championship teams and just phenomenal athletes. Well, this really had its roots, when you look back, in these teams of the 1930s. What's really remarkable to me is how many families are unaware of the accomplishments of these early players in their own families. So friends of mine, I tell them about their mom or something like that, and they'd say, well, I didn't know that. She would help me out when I was practicing, but I didn't know she was such a good player. And so really that's really that role of women at that time became, in a way, part of the San Pedro baseball and softball culture that you saw evolve decades later.
I'm waiting for the softball books to come through, unless they already have some of the books and chapters about that. I want to move on to talk a little bit about these guys. Lou Medina. There's a gentleman, last name Olguin, and also tell us a little bit about Mr. Balsina, who played 15 years here in the minor leagues and broke into the major leagues in 1956.
Okay, so that's a great question. So, so there's this explosion of teams in baseball and softball in the 1930s. Along comes World War II, and a lot of these guys go off to war. So there was sort of a little bit of an interlude in terms of people's ability to participate in local sports. And as I mentioned before, there were many more job opportunities for women, so I imagine that with those job opportunities came less time to devote to sports. But in the aftermath of World War II, you saw more Mexican-American teenagers completing high school at San Pedro High School and taking part in varsity sports to an extent that you didn't see in the pre-war period, which was of course marked by the Depression and just, the men and women just need to get out there and work to support their families. But in the post-war period, players were able to compete more at the high school level. So this is where you see really great players come into being, like Lou Medina that you mentioned at San Pedro High School. I think he graduated in 1951, and he was one of the first guys to be signed up in the minor leagues and played in the minor leagues and continued to play in the San Pedro area for many years after that. Bobby Balsena had played at San Pedro High School in the early 1940s, and in the post-war period, he became the first Filipino American, the first Asian American to break into Major League Baseball when he played for the Cincinnati Redlegs. So he would say, you know, I wasn't up there for very long, but I was there. A couple other names that come to mind from that era are Ray and Ernie Martinez. So Ray Lou Medina was a Barton Hill guy. Ray and Ernie were both La Rambla guys. Ray goes on to get a job with the Boys Club of San Pedro in the 1950s, and he really becomes an important character in the development of local sports in his role as a program director and later on as a director of the San Pedro Boys Club. Ernie Martinez played baseball throughout the 1950s after playing at San Pedro and Mary Star High Schools, and went on to be to a very successful coaching career at Furman Las Juan and later at Bishop Montgomery High School, where he won a CIF baseball championship in 1975.
So tell me, Ron, during your research when writing the book, what stories like stood out to you? What did you find as far as like some special stories through your journey?
You know, I always tell people that it's kind of like an archaeological dig, where you're kind of like, the field is like this big flat field, and you don't know where to begin. And so you dig a little hole here, and you dig a little hole there. You find something here, you find something there, and gradually a picture starts to emerge of what was going on. There were some great stories that came to me through different means. One came from president of the San Pedro Bay Historical Society. She mentioned she came across the name of a guy named Manuel Silva. So when I heard the name, I thought, well, Silva may be of Portuguese descent, may be of Mexican descent. So I looked into his genealogical background, researched that, and I discovered that his father was a Portuguese immigrant, his mother was of Mexican descent. And what was really interesting about Silva was that he played for San Pedro teams in the early 1900s, but he was recruited to play for the Nebraska Indians, which were one of the top Native American teams of that era. So what this team would do would be to barnstorm across the U.S. and take on other top teams, whether they were university teams, the best local community teams, military teams. It didn't matter. They would just take on the best local teams in their travels. And they had something like a 75% win rate. So just an incredibly powerful team. So that's one that really stood out to me. Another thing that stood out was just the longevity of some of these careers. So I had an uncle named Andy. He played on my grandfather's teams. He was a pitcher. And from looking at his career, I realized that he played in every decade from the 20s to the 50s, including the 1940s when he had a stint in the U.S. Army. But to be able to pitch for that long a time struck me as really remarkable. Other things were just personally very interesting. I'd always heard of a team called the Harbor Merchants. So this was a team that was, it started in San Pedro as the San Pedro Panthers with several La Rambla guys. And they got quite good, even competed in Mexico. And they were taken over, the manager became a guy named George De La Torre. So familiar with San Pedro Lincoln history, you know that George was the guy who started Harbor Canning, and which is now Juanita's Foods, maker of many Mexican products. So that business in Wilmington is still in his family. But really, when I found a photo of the Harbor Merchants, the story began to unfold. I saw a lot of names that were familiar, not just from the 50s, but from earlier eras and from later eras. And so what I decided to do was to research each one of those players, and they took me to a whole lot of different playing experiences. And I just came across the photo it was just one of those things that you find by sheer luck. Researching a player named Sam Esparza, who was a cousin of my father's, and there I found the photo, and that really just opened the door to me for being able to look at Southbay baseball as a whole. It really was the key. One of the really interesting things about George De La Torre, which is pretty well documented in the Wilmington section of the book, is his not just being a player and manager, but developing a local field in Wilmington called Rancho Grande, which is at Pacific Coast in Sanford near the Wilmington Cemetery. So if you can imagine, here's a guy developing a field. He's got a concession stand. There are hundreds of people coming to the games on Sunday afternoons after church, and he even applies for a beer license sometime around 1940. So the sport just showed the remarkable organizational abilities of players, of coaches, of managers to create these associations, to create fields, to create teams, and to create their own competitive environment in an environment here in the United States that was not always easy for them.
So really quick, Ron, just a couple more questions before we wrap this up. You're talking about this topic just right now. So what popped in my head is, as far as like in the bigger picture of the culture and the community, maybe even nationally, what part did like the fans of the community play a part in this whole story?
That's really a great question. One of the photos that I came across came from the LA Public Library collection, and it shows a guy named Jim Mata, who played, at that point he was playing in 1927 for the San Pedro Internationals. And with him in this 1927 photo are a couple of Mexican-American girls. And so I look up Jim Mata's background, of course, but I find references to the girls who would follow this player in particular. So it turned out that there were the newspaper stories referred to them as flapper girls. So here you've got these young Mexican-American women dressed very stylishly for the time, following these players. Another photo that really came to mind was a photo that my aunt Guadalupe kept in her photo album. So she was a sister of my grandfather Jose, his brother Andy, who was a longtime pitcher, and she was an aunt of a number of very good baseball players in San Pedro. But there she is, pictured in her photo album, wearing one of the team hats from one of the teams that my grandfather managed. So she's there with a couple of her young, attractive friends. It's probably like 1928, 1929. And they're part of this group of fans that just follow these teams everywhere. There was a very interesting photo that came from the Aranda family. It came from Francina Guerra Proda specifically. It shows a Mexican band playing at what was then Hollis Field. So there was a picture of her grandfather, Eugene Aranda, a guy who lived across the street from me when I was growing up, and a picture of my grandfather in the background. And they were, my grandfather was a musician, and he was part of a Mexican band that performed at baseball games. So a lot of times you had not just games, but you had entertainment, and you had concessions at these games. Politicians would come out because they wanted to be seen. And this was like a very important part of community life. It was something for families to do. It created this really strong sense of community identity and ethnic pride. The fact that they could do these things, they could accomplish these things, they could create this sense of a community through sports.
All right, thanks, Ron. Do me a huge favor. Can you please hold up that book one more time for everybody watching? Again, it's called Mexican American Baseball in the Southbay. Can you tell us where can our audience get a hold of this book?
You can find it most easily on Amazon. I was going to say Anaheim. On Amazon. We're also holding some book signings at different venues. I've donated a bunch of books to the San Pedro High School Athletic Hall of Fame, so we'll be selling books at attendees of that event. We have an event coming up in Anaheim where we will be selling books at the Anaheim Public Library. In San Pedro, we were recently at the Music by the Sea car show that the Legends Car Club sponsored. So we're trying to put ourselves out in the community, but the easiest way to find it is probably on Amazon.
All right, thanks, Ron. And is there anything else you'd like to say off the top of your head, any messages to our audience before we let you do?
There's one thing. I recently read a book. It's a new book about the Mexican Revolution. It's called Bad Mexicans. And it was written by a woman named Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And it tells the story of people who worked in the United States, people in the Mexican American community, to foment a revolution in Mexico and take down a dictatorship. And she said something there that was, to me, really remarkable, which is you can't really understand the history of the United States or the rise of the American Southwest without understanding the role of Mexico and Mexican Americans. So I think that gaining an understanding of this community and of the role of sports can also be a key to understanding American history. And I would add to that too, it's really not just limited to Mexican Americans. I mean, there are a whole lot of other groups that we can learn about American history through their experience. In Pedro in particular, the Italians, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, Croatians. It has been a really remarkable environment historically.
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We do appreciate it. And until next time, we would love to hear more updates about the book, if there's any other chapters or any of the books, especially that softball.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. My thanks to Random Lengths News, and I appreciate the local journalism that you do.
Thank you.